Hello and welcome. If you're new here, this is a video series where I pretend I'm not just being a bit narcissistic and I'm editing self-portraits so others can learn from my editing workflow inside of Lightroom. In today's video, we're editing this photo that I took last summer where I obviously missed the white balance of my key light and I didn't have a negative fill on the other side of my face, but we're gonna try to deal with all that and try to make it look like it was shot on Kodak Portra Film. So let's jump into Lightroom. And if you're enough of a camera nerd and you like the bokeh that I have behind of me in this photo, I'm actually using a modern lens and I've modded it with an oval bokeh, but I have another video that I'll link up there about that. I'll start by switching the camera profile to camera flat to get a neutral starting point, and first things first, let's do the white balance. Saturation and vibrance go to 100%. And now I'm gonna try and balance the highlights on my face, but keeping in mind that my key light, which was on this side of the face, over here, was a bit too warm. I'm going down with my temperature sliders until I start to see that the highlights are no longer yellow, and I'm also gonna bump the tint towards green to get rid of all that magenta. What I'm trying to do is get these highlights over here to look pretty whitish or at least neutral in color. And I think this is a good starting point. I would normally go for the highlights over here, but as I already said, my key light was a bit too warm. So let's put the vibrance and saturation back down. And as you can see, the photo is starting to look super neutral. The next thing I'm gonna do is turn on my visual helper. This is a preset that I've built and I'm selling on the website, but really you should make one yourself. It's just applying a mask over the entire photo. That's turning the photo black and white without affecting any other setting that I have on the entire image. And right now I can see there is not much separation between the background and the subject. So I'm gonna start by creating a few masks. I'm gonna go to select subject, and the first one is gonna be intersected with a radial gradient on the highlight side of the face. A little bit of something like this. I'm gonna try to keep the center a bit higher than my eyeline, and I'm using this red preview over here to see what part it's affected, so I know I'm not affecting the side of the face that I want in the end to look a bit darker. And in this mask, I'm gonna go with increasing the highlights and maybe the exposure as well just a bit, but I want to mainly target the highlights so I can get a bit of contrast with the darker background over here. Also, my whites are going to go up just a bit and maybe add just a tiny bit of contrast. And I want one more mask to create a bit of a darker foreground on my black t-shirt that doesn't look black at all at this moment. So select subject once again, and I'm holding Alt or Option on a Mac, and I have that binded on my mouse for faster masking. I'm gonna intersect it again with a radial gradient, this time from the bottom side of the image. And again, I'm trying to position the mask off center with my body so it affects the darker side where there should be a bit slight. Let's turn the visual helper off and do the basic adjustment on the entire image. I'm gonna start by bumping up the whites quite significantly, and what I'm looking for is the histogram up here. I'm pushing the whites until they're barely touching the edge of the photo. And I'm gonna do the same with the blacks. And I can see that I'm clipping on the bottom part right here, but that's not that important and I don't mind it that much. I already know that I'm gonna go for a bit of a faded look, so that's okay as long as it's in small portions of the image. Now, I want a bit more details in the shadows so I have something to work with, and I'm gonna tone down the highlights just a bit to get more details in the highlights behind me. But while doing this, I'm gonna lose highlights on my face because I did a poor job while illuminating myself. So let's go back to my previous mask and tweak it a bit more. And what I want now is a bit more highlights on the light side of my face. So I'm gonna push the highlights even further. And while doing this, I'm actually working with the visual helper on so I get a better understanding of just the light and not get influenced by the color contrast between the face and the background. And I'm gonna do one more mask. I'll again select subject and intersect it with a radial gradient from the right side this time. I'm gonna try to hit mostly the side of the face that I want to be a bit darker. I'm gonna push the exposure just a tiny bit to the left. Make the mask just a bit smaller, but the smaller I make it, the more obvious it will be. So that's something I have to watch for. Now, subject separation, pretty good. except this area right here, where I want a bit more separation between my shirt and the shadow in the bushes. So let's do one more mask. I'm gonna go for select background and intersect that with a radial gradient, where I'm just gonna bump the exposure a tiny bit. And I'm gonna hide the middle of this mask behind of me, so it looks natural, like the light is flowing from left to right, and I still maintain a bit of the vignetting that I got in the original photo from my lens. And for the moment, I'm pretty happy with how my exposure looks. Let's turn off the visual helper and focus on the colors. I'm gonna start by applying the color response curves of a Portra film. Let's look through them, and I think I prefer the 800 a bit more, but I'm also checking out all my other options. So yeah, Portra 800 it is. And I'm also going to play a bit with the mounted slider, but if I push it too far, we can see that my shadows are turning green, and that's not something that looks pleasant or that I actually want. So 100% it's a good starting point. Now, let's also pair that with a bit of grain, because 800 ISO film has a lot of grain, but I think my 800% might be a bit much for this portrait, which is rather sharp, so I'm gonna go with all-in-one grain 400. And another thing that I'm going to do, I'm gonna scroll down to sharpness and set it to 0%. I know Portra 800 doesn't have quite a ton of details, and I wanna emulate that as well. Another thing that I wanna do regarding to color is play with the HSL tab. The amount of green in this photo is a bit overbearing, and I want to turn down the saturation in the green zone. I'm going to do that with a color picker. I'm also going to increase the luminance in the oranges and the skin tones. And one more thing that I want to do is add more saturation to my beanie. But I'm going to do that with a mask so I don't mangle the redness on my lips and on my face. So, new mask, select object, let's select the beanie and hope that Lightroom does a good job. And it did a pretty decent job, so let's bump up the saturation a bit more and also add just a bit more warmth so it looks a bit more natural. I can still see that in the shadows there's a bit too much green for my liking, and that's something I want to address next. And here's why: I should have used a negative fill while taking the photos. All the green is basically light reflecting off the leaves of the trees around me, and all that is making it difficult for me to get nice skin tones on the shadow side of my face. I'm gonna go to the calibration panel, turn the greens a bit toward blue for that classic portrait tone, and I'm gonna inject a bit of magenta tint into my shadows to get rid of those greens. And finally, to address the warm thing, I'm gonna push a bit of orange into my shadows and a bit of yellow into my highlights, and I'm also gonna increase the luminance in the highlights just a bit, but I'm paying attention not to overdo it, so saturation has to be roughly around 20 or maybe a bit less. I don't want the photo to be overly warm, but I think a nice warm vibe would go with the summer portrait. And to get a different view over the photo, now I'm zooming out quite a lot. And what I'm noticing is that the center of my face is rather reddish, so let's try and address that as well. I'm first gonna check that it's not coming from my color grading, and that's not the case. So I'm just going to desaturate a bit the redness and also push my red tones into orange, because usually Portra has this tendency to have rather yellowish looking skin tones and kind of desaturated reds overall. So my reds go to plus, let's say 10 or something like that, and my oranges go towards yellow just a tiny bit. Also, I'm desaturating the reds and the oranges, and I'm gonna increase the luminance in the orange channel, and let's see if I wanna do it in the red channel as well. And I like the results, so I'm gonna keep it. One more thing, I'm gonna increase the luminance in the greens as well. This will give me a lot more background separation and will accentuate, maybe even a bit too much, the separation and the oval bokeh that I created modifying my lens. And to address that, let's actually enable profile correction, but I don't want the distortion correction at all today, and I want just a bit of the vignetting correction, take care of the edges over here, which are really dark because I had that oval insert on top of my frontal element. Another thing that I want to do is play with the calibration panel just a tiny bit more and see what colors can I get, because I want some color separation in the highlights over here and a bit of blue or some other hues to make the photo more interesting. So let's see what it looks like if I'm pushing it around. Maybe something like -10 would actually look great, but I'm gonna look at the red channel as well. This seems to mostly affect my face, and I'm gonna leave it to something like +10 to address the redness in the skin, but nothing more. And I'm also going to push the blues towards the left, just a tiny amount, to get a tiny bit of blue in the highlights behind of me. I'm also going to decrease the saturation in the blue channel just a bit, and I'm doing the same with the greens as well, to get a bit of a less saturated look in the photo overall. But with all this going on, I kinda lost contrast in the image, and I want it back. So let's scroll to the curves panel and drop a few points. First, highlights on the face, highlights in the background, shadow side of the face, actual shadow on the t-shirt or in the beard, and let's pull on them. The highlights on the face are going up and the actual shadows are gonna go down, but I'm also going to lift my black point and create a bit of a cinematic though. And the same thing is gonna happen at the upper part of the image. I'm gonna drop the white point, and I'm also going to play around a bit with the white points in the highlights because I don't want them to blow out. All this while keeping this point over here, which is picked from my face, pretty high to create contrast across the face. Now, in terms of details in the shadows, I think we could do a bit better. So let's try and keep this one in place because I don't want this side of my face to get lighter. I want that to be a bit darker. And to get more details in my shadows overall, I'm gonna bump the shadows in the basic panel. And I'm doing this by dragging on the histogram on this upper part right here. It goes like blacks, shadows, exposure, highlights, and whites. And if you click and drag to the left or to the right, you can adjust the basic values over here. And it's a very quick way to adjust your photo on the go, because the histogram stays up there no matter where you're scrolling in your settings. But before I got distracted, I was raising the shadows. So let's play around with shadows and see how much shadow detail I want in my photo. I'm also gonna increase this just a bit. I want it to be contrasty, but I don't want to lose completely the shadow details, because there is quite a large portion of the image that's basically dark. My t-shirt was black, so I have to be mindful of that and not crush it completely or have just a big dark blob in the middle of the image. And finally, let's address the one problem that I talked right at the beginning of the video and I never addressed. I'm going into the mask again. On my first mask, I'm going to drop the saturation of the highlights on my face. This way, the left side of my face, it's not going to be way too warm because I missed the white balance on my light. That might not be enough, so let's do again, select subject. I like this method where I do multiple masks that have the same effect, but they're not the same size and not in the same place, because I get more control and it's harder to tell that I used a mask if I have multiple shapes all around the image. So two radial gradients that will both reduce the temperature and a bit of the saturation on the brightest side of my face. And just before I finish, I'm also going to increase the size of the grain particles just a tiny bit more. But not too much, because I do have a lot of details over here. And that's about it for today. This is the photo that I got straight out of the camera, very contrasty and with a wanky white balance. This is it, corrected with a neutral camera profile and the right white balance, where you can see it looks super flat. And this is my final edit. I hope you like it and that you learned something along the way. And if you did, you know where the buttons are, and maybe also share the video with a photographer friend. Next up, I'm planning to do a video about tips and tricks that I use to emulate film inside the Lightroom. Maybe like a bigger one with all the little tricks so I can reference it in the future. Let me know if you're interested in that in the comments down below. And until next time, bye.